Second. It worked perfectly when I did it before, and I could between right. There's a problem here because I can't seem to get onto my second slide.
Is it that you have to re-enter the Zoom meeting at the bottom? I think that happens sometimes when you open the slides. You have to re-enter the Zoom meeting at the bottom.
It works now.
I think you're done. Yeah, fine.
It's working, yes. Okay, so but I don't want to go back. Okay, so I'm going to concentrate on Bhikkhu Ananda Metteya, or Alan Bennett, as he was born. He called himself towards the end of his life Ananda M, and so I should probably call him in this presentation Ananda M. And that's a quick rundown of his of some dates. Born in 1872. His first visit to Sri Lanka was in 1900, and that visit is often forgotten. He then went from Sri Lanka to colonial Burma and gained his novice ordination at the end of 1901 and Upasampada in 1902. And he returned to Sri Lanka to speak at the opening of Metteyyas Hall in 1903, and then died in 1923. So I'm going to, the structure of my presentation is surrounds these different stages: his first visit to Sri Lanka, and his return to open Metteyyas Hall, his ongoing link to Sri Lanka, particularly through CASSIUS PEREIRA, or Venerable Kassapa as he became in the 1940s, one of your founding fathers, and the continued help he received from Sri Lanka. So yes, I've just... So what I'm sharing with you today is part of a publication. I'm working with Dr. John Lowell Crowe in the United States on a comprehensive biography of Ananda M, and it will be completed and submitted this year. I first became interested in Ananda M when I was doing my doctorate in Sri Lanka in the early 1990s. And I discovered his writings at the Buddhist Publication Society, and I was absolutely enthralled. Now you'll have to excuse me, I'm actually getting over COVID, but non-infectious now. So I became interested in him in the early 1990s and loved his writings. They appealed to me because of their passion, his love of Buddhism, and I was hooked, really. So when I returned to the UK in the mid-1990s, I wrote the Buddhist Publication Society study. And
your mics, everybody, please.
Yes, I think there's some interference, isn't there?
Sorry about that.
So in the last few years, I've been doing research in Sri Lanka and in Myanmar on Ananda M, and this is all feeding into the biography. There are still some questions, though, that I haven't had answered, so I'm really hoping that you'll be able to help me with some of those questions. So to Sri Lanka and Ananda Metteya's initial visit in 1900. Now, a notice of Ananda Metteya's death in the Buddhist Annual of Ceylon, and that was, I think, the 1923 Annual of Ceylon, only mentioned Ananda M's 1903 visit, but he was there in 1900, sent by Alistair Crowley for his health, because one thing that Ananda M suffered right throughout his life was chronic asthma. Now, when he came in 1900, he brought a strong interest in Buddhism. We know he'd read the Light of Asia, and we know he'd worked with the Dhammapada and been copying verses from the Dhammapada in Pali with English translation. And he also brought a general interest in meditation and reaching higher states of consciousness through meditation. And in Britain, he'd been a theosophist, but quite interestingly, he didn't offer himself to the theosophists in Sri Lanka because they were there helping with Buddhist education, founding Buddhist schools. He didn't offer himself to the theosophists. He first of all went to study Pali at the Divigalahena Devagiri Purana Viharaya in Cambodia. How and why? Now, Cassius Pereira's obituary claimed it was his father, J.E. Richard Pereira, who gave Ananda M an introduction to the Cambodia Viharaya. But how did Bennett come to know the Pereira family? That's an unanswered question. So if anyone here has any ideas about that, I'd be very grateful to hear them. One theory that I've got is that there was a Scottish link. Bennett sometimes called himself Alan MacGregor or Alan MacGregor Bennett because of the influence of a MacGregor on him in Britain. Now, MacGregor is a Scottish name, although Alan Bennett was certainly not born in Scotland. Richard Pereira, Cassius's father, married a woman of Scottish descent, Jeanie Mary Wilson, Cassius's mother. Did this bring them together? Was he presenting himself as Scottish? I don't know. These are pictures of the Viharaya in Cambodia. Some of the well, the Dagobah and so on have been there when Alan Bennett or Ananda M actually stayed at the Viharaya. And I went there with my research assistant, Sevandi Marasinghe. I don't know if she's here today. I invited her, but yes, we went together and spoke to the head. And the head monk at the time that Ananda M went there was a respected Pali scholar in the Amanapura Nikaya, Venerable Veragampitta Sri Revathatera. The current head monk, to whom we spoke, claimed that Venerable Revata had written diaries that had mentioned Ananda M, but that these had been removed by another scholar and not returned. So we couldn't access those. But we spoke to the head monk, and we also spoke to some of the villagers, particularly the son of a person called Peter Singo, who was like a village historian, and the son was called Mahindaratana. And so we were able to get some of the oral memory of the actual presence of Ananda M in that village. Apparently he attempted to preach in Pali, and at first there was a little bit of resistance from the villagers to this, but then I think he got quite a reputation. We were told that he was known for the thinness of his body, you know, the thin white man. But so there's definitely oral memory of him being present at this. And so we can imagine what it was like for him. I think he must have learnt some rudimentary Sinhala. He loved nature, so he would have gone walking in the villages and outside the actual vihara. But he went there to learn Pali, so he would have spent his time doing this with the head monk or whoever else was teaching him, and probably reading Buddhist texts, because this is obvious from the later things he wrote. And some would have been in translation. By 1900, quite a lot of translations of the Pali texts would have come to Sri Lanka from the Pali Text Society, from the Sacred Books of the East series and so on. And he might have used some of these. And he would have taken part as a lay person in activities of the Vihara. And I've no doubt he practiced meditation as well, having done this in Britain. But I asked the question, did he find the interest in meditation that he expected among the other? Because he actually leaves the Viharaya within a few months. And we found a letter that suggests this is in about August 1900. And he goes not to a Buddhist, but to a Shaivite teacher, Ponnambalam Ramanathan. Now, Ramanathan was Solicitor General at the time and a supporter of Buddhist education and a politician. But he was not only this, he was becoming known as a Shaivite spiritual teacher, proficient in yoga. And it's because of this that I think that Ananda M was drawn to him. And I ask, had Ananda M become disillusioned with the Sri Lankan monastic Sangha? I'll return to that. But he goes back to an interest he had in the UK, an interest in yogic practice. Now, Alistair Crowley claimed he was employed to tutor Ramanathan's younger sons. Now, we haven't found proof of this. Ramanathan married in 1874, and in his first marriage, he had 3 sons, Maheshan, Rajendran, and Vadevan. But if he was married in 1874, they probably weren't young by the time Ananda Metteya was with him in 1900. And I've tried to find when Ramanathan's sons were born, and I haven't been able to do so. So another unanswered question at the moment. So meditation, as he was taught by Ramanathan, it's obvious that Ananda M is using Hindu and Buddhist methods. And CASSIUS PEREIRA's writings confirm this. And during the time in Colombo, Ananda M visits the Pereira household and teaches CASSIUS meditation. And it's obvious that he teaches him an eclectic mix. And later, CASSIUS wrote that Bennett was then, and I quote, vague, wonder-seeking, and really only played about the fringe of a truly marvelous avenue for study and practice. He later told Alec Robertson that Bennett experimented with an Indian form of pranayama, which meant taking in long breaths and then holding the breath. Excuse me, this cough. But whilst with Ramanathan, I think Bennett realized he should go back to Buddhism. And perhaps I should add here that in the mid-1990s, when I was writing the Buddhist Publication Society little booklet on Ananda M, I had talks with Alec Robertson about his relationship with Venerable Kassapa, or CASSIUS PEREIRA. And some of the information I have here comes through Alec Robertson. But so he works with Ramanathan, but suddenly realizes he should go back to Buddhism. And the next moment we're going to go to is July 1901, when he lectures on the Four Noble Truths in Colombo at the Hope Lodge of the Theosophical Society. Now, again, I'm not sure where that lodge was or still is. I'm pretty sure that Ananda M would not have had links with the Theosophists in Colombo, but probably the venue was booked by the Pereiras, Richard Pereira. Now, the lecture is quite remarkable. It shows that Ananda M has moved away from reliance on concepts of the soul and God, emphases found in Theosophy and Shaivism. It's evident that he's studied Pali literature. It's evident also that he has a large heart for Buddhism and that he was quite critical of the British. He wrote, well, we forget our civilization must also perish. Under the law of anicca, everything is impermanent. And so there's criticism of the British also in his presentation. But he's also quite diffident. He craves indulgence for what he gets wrong. He's aware, he says, that he was not Buddhist born. But what he says is incredibly meaningful. He spent a lot of time on the first noble truths, what he calls the pity and woe in all sentient existence. And one of the reasons for this, I believe, is that he'd actually had quite a lot of suffering in his own life and his own asthma and so on. So this is one small extract from what he says. And knowing the great truth of the oneness of all, not merely of all humanity, but of all holiest and meanest life, have you learnt this? And can you say, this day I have no sorrow? No sorrow when the eyes of your brothers are filled with tears, when the whole face of fair-seeming nature is but the mask of an intolerable and continuous cruelty, when the air vibrates with the cry of helpless things in pain. That's kind of... And then on the question of soul and anatta, he says, or he said, we love life and we hate death. So we make into ourselves an idol, a being or a ghost or soul living within us that shall live forever when our bodies shall be no more. That belief in an enduring soul and undying and unchanging principle in man, says the law, is the fruit in your being of the desire for life. Give up, says the good law, that fondest folly and illusion of man, that belief in an immortal soul, for there is nothing here that shall not in time, nor aught that is worthy to endure forever. And then he goes on. I mean, one kind of concept that kind of drives Ananda M right throughout his life is compassion. And so he goes on in this speech. His wisdom and compassion, the Buddha's wisdom and compassion, fills our hearts with an unspeakable peace and gives birth within us to the wish to imitate, however humbly, that unparalleled life, that pity, that love. Then he says, if I were asked to express Buddhism in one word, that the word I should use would be pity. Pity because it implies love, as well as the sorrow which stands as the foundation of our faith. And then he says that we may imitate so far as lies in our small power, his wisdom, his renunciation, and above all, his infinite compassion. That should be the aim. The text of the lecture was published by CASSIUS PEREIRA's father and published in The Buddhist, which in 1902 was taken over by the YMBA. CASSIUS PEREIRA listened to it, and he was just 15, and he later wrote that he made a vow at the lecture that he would one day renounce. And of course he does, but not until he's in his 60s in 1947. And that again is taken from what he wrote in the Ceylon Daily News Vesak number of 1947. So I would like to stress that the symbolic power of seeing a Westerner speaking about the Four Noble Truths in the colonial context of British domination was extremely powerful at that time. And after the talk, Bennett was visited by his friend Alistair Crowley, who went more to the occult later in his life, but we haven't got time to go into that. And they both rented a furnished bungalow in Kandy, and they had a yoga retreat. And we know from Crowley's notebooks that they again combined Buddhist and Shaivite methods. They used a Sanskrit text that's linked with Hinduism, but also concepts that were very much Buddhist. Rumors must have circulated while they were there. I've been told that an article was published in a Sri Lankan paper about voodoo being practiced at the house they rented. I've not been able to find that particular article. Again, any help that could be given would be very, very much appreciated. But there's no doubt that Bennett was moving towards ordination at this time and rejecting some of the methods of Ramanathan. And he chooses colonial Burma. Why? I think he felt that Buddhism was purer there. But also he'd met a Burmese person, Dr. Tan Nu, who supported the Mahabodhi Society. And I think Dr. Tan Nu kind of facilitated him coming to Akyab to be ordained. And that was probably the immediate call for him to Burma. But again, as I'll say later, when he comes back, he was a little negative about some of the practices of the Sri Lankan monastic Sangha. Cassius Pereira, just 15, when Ananda M gives a talk on the Four Noble Truths. But Alec Robertson told me that Venerable Cassius had told him that the two had an almost telepathic communication, that they knew what the other was writing and thinking, and they knew when the other was writing to them. So an almost telepathic communication. I think many letters have been lost between them. The few letters that we have show that they communicated on scientific subjects, and Ananda M was a scientist when he was a lay person, and was fascinated by scientific discoveries right throughout his life, and argued that Buddhism and science are completely compatible. And Cash, as Ananda M called Cassius Pereira, was drawn into these conversations. And then also, having read quite a lot that Cassius Pereira has written, as well, of course, as what Ananda M has written, I see some remarkable similarities between the writings of the two of them as they developed, as Cassius Pereira developed. For instance, some Western writings about Buddhism at this time stressed that Buddhism was only a philosophy. It was not really a religion at all. Now, both Cassius Pereira and Ananda M kind of contested this. They both defended Buddhist devotion, the importance of faith, not a kind of blind faith, but as a mature love and confidence in the Buddha and in his teachings. Both of them also championed samatha meditation, anapanasati, and other forms of meditation that use an object. And so I think this shows quite a close relationship between the two, even to the extent of the way they saw Buddhism. But from Sri Lanka, I'm sorry, not from Sri Lanka, from Myanmar, Ananda M founded International Buddhist Society, the Buddhist Asana Samagama, and that's a photograph we have of him at one of the meetings that formed the particular organization. Some of his, but he retains close contact with Sri Lanka, and particularly with the Pereira family. In fact, he becomes better known after he leaves in 1901. And part of this, of course, is because he became ordained. The symbol of the robe, the Theosophists did not become Buddhist monks, although they did so much to support Buddhism in Sri Lanka. Ananda Metteyya, or Ananda M, did. And through Richard Pereira, plus the journal of the Buddhist Theosophical Society, the Saraswati Sandaresa, and the Buddhist, we get Sri Lankans were getting news of Ananda M. In fact, as a novice in Akya, he sent 2 articles to Sri Lanka that were published in the Buddhist, one called Animism and Law, and one on the culture of mind. And I haven't got time to go into the content of those. But also the Buddhist, that's the Sri Lankan, the Buddhist, published his higher ordination address in 1902, in which he set out his wish to basically convert the West to Buddhism. That was his dream, and he felt the West was ready for it. But he's drawn back to Sri Lanka, he's invited back, and it's all connected with Maitreya Hall and what eventually became the Servants of the Buddha. And we get quite a lot of information from Ananda M's writings. The project had unpretentious beginnings. It began as a thatch building where lay English-speaking Buddhists taught English and Western learning to monks to equip them for Buddhist mission. And Ananda M said that when the permanent building was eventually built, it cost 6,000 rupees. What that would be now, but anyway. And Robertson, in his later writings, said that the permanent building was modelled on a church to wean Buddhists away from Christian churches. And it was built on land owned by Richard Pereira, and Jeannie laid the foundation stone. Jeannie was a Christian, but eventually converted to Buddhism with the whole PEREIRA family. And I got this information from Dilke Pereira, who I also invited to this presentation, but she's in Canada and traveling and couldn't come. And she's the niece of CASSIUS Pereira. Ananda M was invited to open the hall on the 25th of April, 1903. And this is probably what he looked like. Now, this photograph was printed in a Vesak number only after Ananda M's death, but it was taken by the Colombo apothecaries. I think the only time when Ananda M was actually in Sri Lanka after his ordination was in 1903. So I'm pretty sure that shows him in 1903 when he came back to Sri Lanka. So imagining his address this time, he's better known. So probably the hall where he's speaking is much more packed, is much fuller. His theme was Western education for Buddhist bhikshus. There would have been Sinhala, Tamil, Burgha, and English people there, according to the descriptions we have. And at the head table, 3 of the most well-known Buddhist revivalists was there. Mahagodana Nisara, Ikadue Sumangala, and Dodandue Piyaratana. Sarasavi Sandaresa describes him entering the decorated pulpit with a tall body and pleasant facial appearance. Again, he adopts a very diffident kind of pose. He claims that each member of the monastic Sangha present is superior to him because he's so young in the Sangha. But again, the symbol of a white person in monastic robes would have been almost seismic at that time and a real booster to Buddhist confidence under colonialism. So what did he say? Well, it was completely in line with the aims of Metteyyas Hall, which was to present Buddhist knowledge in English to English-speaking Sri Lankans, but also to train bhikkhus so that they could speak English fluently and so on. So he mounted a spirited defense of the need to teach bhikkhus English and Western learning if Buddhism is to hold its own. And also he mentioned the threat of Christianized education, and that this meant that bhikkhus should not just wait for lay people to come to them, they had to go out, they had to be proactive. And that they should teach with knowledge of Western arguments, with modern illustrations. And he was particularly thinking of the scientific experiments, scientific theories of the day. For instance, bhikkhus should not teach that the world was flat and that kind of thing. But he also stressed in his inimitably courteous way that he was not reproaching Christian teachers. He acknowledged their sincerity, but simply added that Buddhists believe their views mistaken. So again, I shall give you 2 snippets from this talk, just to show you his style. What is most needed today in Ceylon is a body of priests capable of explaining the law from the Western standpost, of illustrating it by modern similes, capable of holding their own in a controversy, capable of meeting the rising generation of Sinhalese on their own level from their newer standpoint, and not from the standpoint of 1,000 years ago. The time is past now when your monks can satisfy the religious needs of this people by remaining shut up in their monasteries, waiting for the laymen to come and hear them preach. And if Buddhism is to hold its own in Sri Lanka, you must create a body of priests that are full of energy and zeal to preserve the faith, willing to work, and above all, able to preach the law to men of Western education, without showing themselves ignorant of the facts known to every schoolboy in an English school. For example, that the world is round, and he makes an example of this. Then he goes to exhortation. And it's not gender neutral, I apologize for that, but I can't change the kind of style of Ananda M. Make of this then, O men of Lanka, make of this a national work, the germ and center of a new life for Ceylon. Give it of your wealth and leisure that have these to give. Infuse into it that old fire of your race that aforetime wrought those mighty works in Sri Lanka that today are testified to only by stupendous ruins. Are your hearts also in ruins, ye of the lion race, whose pride and hope was in this Buddhist faith? Is the old spirit dead amongst you that are the descendants of those great of old? Nay, surely, for their blood runs in your veins, their energy and their devotion are the spirit of your national life. So that was his kind of tone. And at the beginning of the talk, he did criticize the monastic Sangha when he was there, because apparently he found some of them drunk alcohol and this kind of thing. And this might have and fed into his decision to go to Myanmar rather than so in 1903, he was preaching an engaged Buddhism before Rahula Walpole's book, Bhiksu Vagga Ulamaya, in 1946. He demonstrated his absolute commitment that Buddhism should present itself as compatible with science, and was showing his resistance to Christian influence, whilst yet insisting on courtesy to Christians. And he poured into the talk his hope for Buddhist revivalism. And he stayed on until the 8th of June, so a couple of months. And he gives a talk every Sunday at the Metteyyas Hall at 5 p.m. We're told that the entry fee was 10 cents. Metteyyas Hall did have some debts, and no doubt this went towards meeting those debts. On the 2nd of May, though, he was in Kandy, and he gave a talk on temperance at Dharmaraja College. It seems that the audience then committed themselves to forming a temperance society. This is quite interesting also, because articles have been written concentrating on 1904 as the year when the temperance movement kind of developed in Sri Lanka. But in 1903, Ananda M is encouraging, or at least has encouraged those in Kandy to form a temperance society. Last talk on the 7th of June at Metteyyas Hall on right living, and the Saraswati Sandaresa says that many wept when they heard he was leaving. So just a few more slides now. Back in Myanmar, Ananda M certainly retained contact with Sri Lanka through CASSIUS PEREIRA and the Anagarika Dharmapala. Now, it's no time to go into the relationship between Dharmapala and Ananda M, but they were in contact. Ananda M publishes news in his journal, Buddhism. And again, I think many letters between Cash and Ananda M were lost. But one of them that we do have commends to Cash Venerable Nyanatiloka, who was ordained in Myanmar and wanted to come to Sri Lanka to learn Pali. And so Ananda M asks Cash to help with his support and accommodation as a senior monk. But of course, as many of you will know, that Venerable Nyanatiloka becomes very famous in Sri Lanka and ordains a series of Westerners as bhikkhus. But Ananda M never returns to Sri Lanka. In 1908, no time to go into that. But, okay, going onwards to perhaps history that is not known. Ananda M remained in Myanmar until 1914. His mission to Britain was just a few months and he came back. But by 1914, his health had collapsed and really his sponsors in Myanmar could no longer cope with him. So they sent him back to England and he has to disrobe because it would mean, because going by ship to Britain meant he would have to use money. He gets back to Britain and is supported by the Buddhist Society of Great Britain and Ireland that was formed to greet his mission in 1908. And he still lived the life of a bhikkhu and is often referred to as the bhikkhu, although he's evidently in lay dress. And financial help comes from Myanmar and Sri Lanka to help in his medical care. And we know that CASSIUS PEREIRA also sent money Lists are given in the Buddhist Review of those who've, and that's the Buddhist Review was published from Britain, from London, of those who'd actually supported the society and supported Ananda M. So it is there's a story of financial support from Asia to London in this early part of the 20th century. It's almost a forgotten history, and it's probably worthy of more research. So between 1919 and 1920 in the winter, Ananda M has gained some strength. He's not as ill as he was when he actually returned in 1914. And he's persuaded to give lectures in London by a person called Clifford Bax, who was well known as a broadcaster, a playwright, an artist. He's a free thinker. And he, in his studio in Kensington, he gets Ananda M to give a series of lectures. And these were published just before Ananda M's death in 1923 as The Wisdom of the Aryas. Now, Ananda M sends a copy to Cassius Pereira. Almost immediately they're published on the 2nd of February. Cassius Pereira logs it into his collection on the 6th of March. And he also writes comments in the margins and apparently reaches up to page 20. Not all the comments were good. In fact, one comment in the margin was rot. And I've kind of tried to get to the bottom of this and think it was due to the fact that Ananda M at the beginning of his lectures spoke very poetically about nature and about seeing, again, Buddhist teaching through nature. Again, that the copy, Cassius Pereira's copy of The Wisdom of the Aryas has, I think, been lost. I've only got this information I've just given to you from a letter sent to me by Sister Nyanasiri in 1995. She knew I was writing about Ananda Metteyya, and she'd been given Cassius Pereira's copy of The Wisdom of the Aryas. And she sent me a letter and told me about an interleaved letter as well from Ananda Pereira that was with the book. But since Sister Nyanasiri's death, I've not been able to trace a copy of the book. Again, if anyone could help me, it would be fantastic. So, but slide. Ananda M dies in March 1923. The immediate cause was an intestinal blockage, but his body had been weakened with asthma over the years, and he'd been pressing himself very hard to keep the Buddhist Society of Great Britain and Ireland going, and had basically worn himself out. Now, Cassius Pereira is one of the first to write an obituary, and this is, and now the worker has, for this life, laid aside his burden. One feels more glad than otherwise, for he was tired. His broken body could no longer keep pace with his soaring mind. The work he began, that of introducing Buddhism to the West, he pushed with enthusiastic vigor in pamphlet, journal, and lecture, all masterly, all stimulating thought, all in his own inimitably graceful style. And the results are not disappointing to those who know. So, you know, from the age of 14 or 15, one of your founders, Cassius Pereira, Venerable Kassapa, and Metteyya, being inspired by him, but also helping him to survive up until March 1923. And I believe the two were exceptionally close, both spiritually and in their friendship. So I'm going to finish there. Thank you very much for your indulgence and for listening to me.